Hi everyone, welcome. We're usually over in my wormery, but there's this one section of my basement where over here behind these cardboard barriers, have my filming booth for my time-lapse videos. So over there, underneath the wood platform, is the camera tucked away in darkness, shooting through this little opening over in the direction of the subject matter over there. The little mirrors are just bouncing light from below to try to increase the light level a little bit in the scene, but not too much. And the camera's being controlled by that little laptop computer. So we're at the point where I need volunteers, and I know where to get them. So into the wormery, and some of you might know exactly what's coming up next. Let's get to it. Yep, you guessed it. It's the European night crawlers who've been now for the past 5 weeks in the process of migrating out of their finished castings over into the horizontal migration feeding zones underneath the plastic over there. Really quick, let's just go through the stats here. The bins are 329 days old now, 47 weeks, 5 weeks of which has been migration. And the other oddity here, besides the fact that we're trying to get the worms to move out, is that we've been composting wool with these worms. Wool that's going to have to accompany them into their new home at this point. And I got some ideas on how to help make that happen. So part of this check-in is going to be to get recruits, give the system a little bit more food to help keep promoting the migration of the worms out of their finished castings. At the same time, we get to do a little aeration of the material that the worms inhabit, because yeah, they're still hanging out in this stuff, especially over in bin number 1, where it's been very damp. So I've been in here a few times, 5 times actually, to aerate bin number 1. Bin number 2 has been a little bit better already, drying out nicely, worms moving out, but I did aerate that one time too while we were waiting for this past 11 days to elapse since the last check-in. So let's get these systems up on the bench and get to work. So the volunteer worms that we managed to recruit today will be coming with me in these 3 little containers over to the time-lapse bin, and they're not going to get any of this delicious additional food being provided to help continue spurring on the migration of the worms out of their material. But I think probably the main motivator is the drying of the material, which occurs each time we come in here and upturn it and submerge the dry stuff that's out on the surface, and at the same time bring the more damp stuff that's down low out to the surface to give it a chance to evaporate and dry. But what I'm doing over here now is just getting on with the aeration of the material. But as you can see, there's still worms occupying this stuff. Every time I would come in here to do one of these aerations, every time I would encounter a little something, whatever it might be, that's more than just crumbly castings between my fingers flowing, little chunk of leftover food or something, I would just chuck it in here. You can see little signs of stuff that's made its way over into the horizontal migration feeding zones as I would plow through. Over here in bin number 2, like I said earlier, the material has already shown to be nice and dry already, or at least drier it seems, than the material in bin number 1, because many more worms appear to have already exited it. Look at this stuff. It's almost completely depopulated of worms. Nevertheless, I think giving it a stir too now is fine. It'll just help motivate the last few stragglers that are still hanging out in this stuff to get out, to make their way over into the migration feeding zone, and, you know, accompany the rest of the gang with the fun that they're going to have in their new home when it comes time to haul them out. The wool fabric is pretty much the only bedding that I've been using down here in the horizontal migration feeding zone. I usually set up my horizontal migration feeding zones with a bunch of nice fresh bedding, but here I've been really wanting the worms to focus on working down the sweater. So over here, it's only the sweater that we've been using as the foundation for the feedings. Last time too, we took a few chunks of the sweater, placed them under the food that they got, and then A little bit more of the sweater was sprinkled out onto the top, and that was about it. And here and there, as I'm going through the material, aerating past few times, over here in bin number 1, I might have encountered a few chunks of leftover fabric that came dislodged from the main article of clothing and was just floating around out here in the bin, so I would always throw it over here on top to make sure it's with the rest of the stuff. So the time to recruit volunteers is now, I believe. But at the same time, I've also got an interesting idea for how we're going to continue isolating the wool fabric, because as it starts breaking apart into little itsy bitsy pieces, it does seem like it's getting harder and harder to manage. It last time too, I remember picking through and finding so many chunks of the sweater that I figured this time we would actually collect every piece up that we encounter, including large chunks that don't really end up belonging in the finished vermicompost over on that side. Even over here, if we see something that's worthy of being pulled out, why not? This is one of our opportunities to try to refine the quality of our vermicompost to something really beautiful. So over here in the horizontal migration feeding zone, I'm going to start pulling out. This is actually leftovers of the food they got last time, a banana peel. Each system got 2 banana peels, in addition to, gosh, what else was it? It would have been some really yummy, tasty stuff, but I knew that after only 11 days since the last check-in that we would still find leftovers of the banana peel. Radish leaves, that's what it was. Something that I knew would go very quickly, because radish leaves really do break down quickly on their own, whether or not they're in a worm bin or not. I mean, look at these fragments of wool. It's amazing how nicely it's breaking down. Well, I don't think balancing it over there is going to work. We're just going to have to hold it. But you could see as I extract all these pieces, some of them are really, really far gone. Oh my goodness. It does seem like there's just one sort of a backbone, almost, piece of thread holding multiple little fragments together. I bet you that is going to end up being some sort of a synthetic material that the worms are unable to break down the way it's holding together, even after I kind of yanked it out of the pile over here. And it just feels like there's so many worm castings here too. I was kind of hoping for like a worm ball that I might be able to recruit volunteers from, but it seems like if I were to do that, I would get a handful of vermicompost coming along for the ride too. So I don't know, we'll have to get to that when we get to that. So let's just finish clearing all this basically bedding out, and guess what, going forward we're going to keep the wool fabric isolated by keeping it in this plastic until it's been completely broken down, perhaps with the exception of leftover radish. I gave them an entire radish because I found it amongst the leaves. But yeah, at this point, this should be an easier way to just make sure we're keeping track of all the wool fabric. It'll be in the plastic box now. And kind of like we do when we're trying to bait stragglers out of stuff, at this point, this horizontal migration is going to sort of transform into a baiting operation, if you will, to get the worms to gather here amongst the bedding and the foods that they're going to get, but then also at the same time find themselves in the plastic container with which we'll be able to transport them to their new home when the time comes. But I think this will be a really good way to keep the wool fabric isolated, so we can really keep a close eye on how it's progressing. Like I said before, it's just going to have to accompany the worms to their new home, because even though it's breaking down nicely at this point, it just kicked into high gear a few check-ins ago. Up until then, it was just sort of stagnating, going nowhere, it seemed. But I really have no sense of how much longer it's going to take, so it did seem to me like something along these lines would be a really keen way to collect up all the fragments, and from that point forward know that you've got them all in a single spot instead of always having to go fishing around for them the way we are doing here. So let's I guess let's proceed to trying to get some volunteers together. I really did hope to have a kind of a worm party going on from which I could just pull worms out, but I'm not sure if that's really possible. It does seem like a whole bunch of material is just going to come along for the ride. So here I only need to get like 1.5 of these little cups loaded with wormies. So let's see what we could do. I guess a little bit of familiar material will be accompanying the worms over. And, well, it's not a very large container that they're going to be doing the time lapse in. Doesn't seem like we need a terribly huge number of worms to make it into an interesting operation over there. So I'm hoping that 3 containers such as this, filled to the brim, will work nicely for us in terms of populating the time lapse. So here we'll just try to get this container to about halfway full, and then we'll get a similar group of volunteers out of bin number 2. And I tried to rehearse this operation in my mind a couple times, just because I'm doing a couple things a little differently than usual in terms of collecting volunteers and isolating experimental materials. But now I think it's time to proceed to doing the same exact thing over here in bin number 2. And I'm starting to wonder if perhaps this portion of the video might just get sped up for the sake of making it a little less redundant and boring. So maybe that's just the way it'll get depicted when I put the video together later. I guess I'll have to decide later. But maybe I can just shut up and tell myself now in advance that that's just the way it's going to be and that there's no need to narrate. Alright, let's get our volunteers together. I wonder how much wool I took along for the ride. So, these are our volunteers for our special mission over at the time lapse, which at this point I'm not going to really be showing you any more of. I just need to go over there and release those little guys, but at this point we've still got the matter of isolating the wool. So let's get that taken care of over here. Again, probably in fast motion, so I'll give myself a break on narration. I gotta say, that went down quite nicely. I was able to pull out the bulk of that material in one felt swoop right there in the beginning, so it didn't take long at all. So I think we can now proceed to letting the worms in here that remained. Oh, I got another large piece of fabric over here. So the next step is to let these worms continue with the fabric and with the migration out of the material that they inhabit. But now that we've got the bedding into which the food's going to get placed, isolated in that plastic container, we're going to have to set things up a little differently than we normally would. So let's do it the way I imagined, which was to have a kind of leveled off space, and that'll allow this stuff out here to continue drying, evaporating, becoming less hospitable for worms to want to remain in, spurring on, hopefully, movement in this general direction. And over here, where we've been feeding for a few times, we've still got a good many worms hanging out who are, at this point, in material that's kind of free of food and free of bedding. So coming up here into this box is my idea for trying to get them to, at this point, continue their horizontal migration. And at the same time, just, you know, make it a little bit easier at the end to haul them out and relocate them into their new home. Because at this point, I believe 1 more week from now should be enough to do the initial haul out of worms from these systems to start off either 2 new systems or maybe even just 1 large system with a very large population. It's something I've been thinking of as a possible way to do it with these little guys. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of having a somewhat larger container which has all these worms running in it instead of 2 separate containers. But that could become a little bit of a crowded situation. I don't know if that would be a bit much. I don't know. We'll just have to see. So I've laid in the coffee. Each system's going to get a chunk of celery, a chunk of cucumber, and here's 2 more chunks of celery, and strawberry. Celery, strawberry, and cucumber. Everything begins with the letter C, and that's completely coincidental. I didn't plan it that way. Trust me. And look at all this lovely juice coming in with the feeding. That certainly deserves to go into the box. That in itself is probably going to become a huge motivator to get worms to come up here. And to make it even more compelling, I'm throwing in worm chow and even some grit. This could be like a heaven on earth for the worms, should they happen upon it. So I think that's about it. I'm very curious to see how this works out. I've not yet tried using bait boxes to facilitate a evacuation of vermicompost in terms of migration, but I have a feeling it should work well. The plastic covering should do a fine job keeping everything in the bait box nice and damp. There's the pretty much damp wool fabric into which we just place some nice juicy veggies, and even the juice from the veggies was spilled in at the end so as to not lose a drop. And at this point, I'm tracking towards a week from now to get this thing all, not all completely depopulated. My guess is we'll probably have to keep baiting, but I do want to get these worms moving on, move them into some fresh material. So, you know what? I talked about you guys not seeing what's going on here, but I would still appreciate if you would stick around long enough, because I could use your help. Use your help estimating how many worms we're populating the time-lapse container with. Will you stick with me for that long? Okay, cool. Let's go over there now and release these wormies. All right, here we are, and it's a little bit dimly lit over here. Hopefully the camera's able to bring in enough of the image. But don't forget, this is the time-lapse's moment of glory, so that gets priority. So us filming this now is mainly so you guys can provide me with estimates on how many worms you believe we're releasing into here. But I want to get out of the frame because you might hear it click in a moment. 3, 2, 1, now. Yep. And that was the picture. I'm going to stop the time lapse now, and I'm going to change the interval from what it's going to be operating at normally, which is every 3 minutes taking a frame, and I'm changing it to, I'm trying to decide here. I'm going to go every 10 seconds. And sorry, there's nothing happening on the screen, but at this point, 3, 2, 1. That's the first frame going at 10-second intervals. Now it's 3, 2, 1. The next frame. And I'm going to get to releasing them. Here we go. That's one of them. In. Oh, that was close. I just barely got out of the picture before the photo was taken. So there we go. There's number 2. Here's the next photo getting taken. And number 3. Oop, get out. Whew, that was darn close. And I'll admit, it's going to be very difficult based on this view to get an estimate of how many worms we're releasing into the system, but you guys were there when we were recruiting them, pulling them out of the horizontal migration feeding zones. So hopefully we're able to come up with some sort of a rough estimate as to how many worms we just released into here. Please leave me a comment. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, oh, let me get out of there. I don't want to be in the frame. All right, there we go. Please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.